This is time that we discuss the Bronte sisters, another set of female novelists in the Victorian period. We come to find that there are a few female writers in the Victorian period, and the prominent among them are the Bronte sisters and George Eliot. Mary Ann Evans is called by the name George Eliot. And these are the important female writers during the Victorian period. And Jane Austen actually belonged to the Romantic period. The Bronte sisters and George Eliot belong to the Victorian. And this is time that we discuss the Bronte sisters. And they are Charlotte, Emily and Anne. Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte and Anne Bronte. They were born 2 years with a difference, in a difference of 2 years. Charlotte was born in 1816 and Emily 1818 and Anne in 1820, in the difference of 2 years. Charlotte Bronte seemed to be the eldest, and she was born in 1816. See, Charles Dickens was born in 1812 and William Makepeace Thackeray was born in 1811. And in the case of the Bronte sisters, Charlotte Bronte was born in 1816, 4 years younger to Charles Dickens. So at the same time, only 4 years younger. And she only had a slightly long life, not a very long life. Charlotte only had a slightly long life. She died in 1855 only. So, Emily Bronte was dead in 1848 and Anne was dead in 1849. The death of Emily and Anne happened in the succeeding years. Emily was dead in 1848, only at the age of 30. And Anne Bronte was dead in the next year in 1849 and she was only 29 years old. And Charlotte Bronte alone continued almost for 35 years. And she was the only one who got married also. She was the only one who got married also out of the three sisters. And these three sisters are known for their novels. And each of their novels seems to be the most popular. And as far as Charlotte Bronte is concerned, her novel is Jane Eyre, and it was produced in 1847. And in the case of Emily Bronte, her popular novel is Wuthering Heights, and it was also produced in 1847. And in the case of Anne Bronte, the most popular novel is Agnes Grey, and this was also produced in 1847. And this is one of the very important things about these three novels. The masterpiece of Charlotte Bronte is Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was published in 1847. And the masterpiece of Emily Bronte is Wuthering Heights, and it was also published in 1847. And Anne Bronte has got her masterpiece novel produced in 1847, and it is entitled Agnes Grey. And they were the three daughters of an Irish clergyman, Anglican clergyman, named Patrick Bronte. And they had also a brother named Branwell. And the Brontes lived in the village of Thornton. It was in Yorkshire, a place called Thornton. And all the girls, except Anne, were sent to the clergy daughters' school at Cowan Bridge. And the girls were sent to, because Anne was the youngest and she was not at an age to be sent to the school. Therefore, all the sisters were sent to, there were 5 daughters. And all the 4 daughters were sent to a school called Clergy Daughters School at Cowan Bridge. And this is also called the Cowan Bridge School. And a model of the school can be found in Jane Austen. So, in Jane Austen also, a school with very bad situations is presented. And in Charlotte Bronte's novel, Jane Eyre also, we come to find a school similarly of the nature of the Covent Bridge School, and it is called Lowood School. And Lowood School is actually modeled on the Covent Bridge School, where the daughters were sent to attend the classes. And when attending the classes, two of the girls became dead, gravely ill, and they were removed from the school and they became dead. They were called Maria and Elizabeth. And then there are the three daughters. They are Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. And Charlotte and Emily were also withdrawn from the school. And in Charlotte's novel, Jane Eyre, we come to find the Covent Bridge School is presented as Lowood School. And Covent Bridge School, the condition in the Covent Bridge School is presented through the school, Lowood School. And later Charlotte was sent to Mrs. Woolley's school. And here she met her lifelong friend. When she was studying at the Woolley's school, she met her lifelong friend Mary Taylor and Ellen Nursey. And these two ladies became close friends to Charlotte. And Emily and Anne also studied in the same school, Miss Woolley's school at Rohitch. Miss Woolen's school. It was the next school the daughters were sent to. And the girls read the books in their father's library, like Jane Austen reading books from her father's library. The Bronte sisters also read books from her father's library. And the collection included Bible, Homer, Virgil, Shakespeare, Milton, Byron, and Scott, and the important writers of the period were all being kept there. And there was also Bible and Homer. There was also the translations of Virgil and Shakespeare. And this time they also read the magazines, the popular magazines there, the Edinburgh magazine, the Fraser's magazine, and the magazines were also read by the girls. And all the three of them worked in similar situations. They all started working as governess in families in and around Yorkshire. The experiences are described in the novels of the three sisters, in the three sisters' novels. We come to find such experiences. The ladies are found working as governess, and this is the first-hand experience of these novelists. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne worked as governess in some houses in and around the Yorkshire province. And in Jane Eyre, we come to find the heroine is a governess. A governess is actually meant to look after the children of a family. And in Jane Eyre, we come to find the heroine Jane Eyre functions as a governess. And the same incident is described in Jane Eyre. So there are various experiences. While working as governess. For example, when Charlotte was working in a house, a child there threw a heavy volume of Bible at her. And the same incident is described in Jane Eyre also. The same incident is described. Jane Eyre is thrown with a big volume by the brother of the John Reed family, the son of the John Reed family, the Reed family. John Reed threw a Bible at Jane Eyre. And after all, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne started writing poems in the beginning. And the early poems were collected and sent to Robert.The, because Robert.The was the poet laureate then. For reading and comments, the poems were sent to Robert.The. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne produced poems and sent the poems to Robert.The for his remark. And the poems were put under the name Poems by Currer, Ellis, and Acton. poems by Currer, and they adopted a pseudonym. Currer is the pseudonym of Charlotte. Ellis is the pen name of Emily, and Acton is the pseudonym of Anne Bronte. These three girls adopted pen names. And the collection of the poems, so entitled as Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton. Once UGC asked this question to identify the people from the title, Currer, Ellen and Ellis and Acton. Currer Bell, Ellis Bell and Acton Bell. They are named Currer Bell, Ellis Bell and Acton Bell, and the collection was called Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. In 1847, Charlotte published her novel Jane Eyre, and Emily published her novel Wuthering Heights, and Anne Brown published her novel Agnes Grey. I told you the poems of these sisters were published under the name Poems by Currer, Ellis and Acton, and they adopted the pseudonym Currer Bell, Ellis Bell and Acton Bell, and they sent the collection to Robert Southey for his reading and remark, because Robert Southey was then the poet laureate. And Robert Southey admired the girls for their poems but discouraged them. Southey discouraged them, saying that literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. So your profession should not be literature. Any of the poems are interesting, but literature should not be the career for a lady, and it should never be the career for a lady. It was the opinion made by Robert Southey. Robert Southey threw cold water upon the ladies. So he discouraged them and tried to dissuade them also, tried to bring them out of the profession of literature. But anyhow, they adopted literature as their profession. And Charlotte Bronte came out with her novel, Jane Eyre. And Emily Bronte came out with her novel, Wuthering Heights. And Anne Brown came out with her novel, Agnes Grey. And these three novels were published in the same year, 1847. This was also one question asked by UGC once. 1847 is the year for these three novels. And after all, Jane Eyre, we discussed Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was published in 1847. Originally published as an autobiography. Jane Eyre, an autobiography. The original title was Jane Eyre, an autobiography. And it was published under the pen name Currer Bell. Currer Bell was Charlotte Bronte. And it actually describes the love story of the heroine. So it is the story of the heroine, her love story and her marriage. So, and it is told in absolute frankness and described in a very frank manner. And the second edition of the novel was dedicated to William Makepeace Thackeray. When the novel was produced for a second time, there was a dedication also, and it was to William Makepeace Thackeray. And we come to find that there are various distinct stages in the life of Jane. And the novel starts with Jane's childhood. And she was brought up in a house called Gateshead. Jane is 10 years old at the time when the novel begins. The novel begins when Jane is 10 years old. And she has been living with her maternal uncle's family. She is found living with her maternal uncle's family, and they are the Reeds. As a result of her uncle's dying wish, actually she was brought to the house due to the last wish of the uncle. The uncle died, so with the request that Jane should also be protected in the family. Jane Eyre was brought to the house of the Reeds after the death of Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed was her maternal uncle. And Mrs. Reed and her three children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. John, Eliza, and Georgiana are the three children of Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed and the three children of Mrs. Reed, they tried to ill-treat her physically and mentally. Jane Eyre was ill-treated in the home. Physically and mentally she was ill-treated. And the servant Bessie, there was a servant at the Gateshead Hall, and she alone was of some comfort to Jane Eyre. And there was also a coachman named Robert Leven, and he was also of great help to Jane Eyre. He also comforted Jane Eyre. Bessie and the coachman Robert Leven were the only comfort in the family. And Mrs. Reed ill-treated her. The three children also used to torture her mentally and physically. And John Reed once threw a Bible, a heavy book at her. As she was sitting and reading, John attacked her by throwing a big book at her. And one day, Jane was put in a room, and it is the Red Room where the uncle died. Jane was put in a room, and the room was closed as punishment. Jane was so imprisoned in a room, and the room was closed, and it was the Red Room where the uncle died. And normally the room is not used by the others, but the room was opened for putting Jane there, and they closed the door and went away. And she saw the ghost of her uncle and became frightened and fell unconscious. She shouted. She saw the ghost of her uncle. She fell down and fainted. And a doctor was called to attend to her, named Dr. Lloyd. And it was he who convinced Mrs. Reed to send Jane to a school for the charity students in a distant area. It was Dr. Lloyd who advised Mrs. Reed, and Dr. Lloyd told Mrs. Reed, if you keep Jane Eyre like this, she will be dead. And it will be better to send her to a faraway school so that you will be relieved from her. And Dr. Lloyd was the one who advised Mrs. Reed to send her to a charity school called Loud School for Girls. And the preparations were made for the departure of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre packed up her things, and she was put in the cab driven by Robert Leven, and she was to be taken to the Loud School, which was some 50 miles away from the Gateshead Hall. And before leaving, she tells Mrs. Aunt that she will never call her aunt again. And she was such a strong girl also. She was only 10 years. And at the time when she was about to leave the house, she told the aunt that she will never come back and she will never call her aunt again. And she reached the Loud School. The headmaster of the school was a self-righteous clergyman. So a headstrong clergyman. And he was named Mr. Brocklehurst. Once he asked the name of the headmaster of the school. Mr. Brocklehurst was a cruel man, was a sadistic man. He unnecessarily tortured the students. And also, so he made the students undergo starvation, even though he got money from the benefactors. So the school was sponsored by many number of benefactors from the town. And he grabbed all the money and provided limited food for the girl students there. And so the hygienic condition was also very bad. And the girls were unnecessarily tortured also. And Jane was introduced by him. He introduced Jane to the school as a liar, not to be believed. And Mrs. Reed sent a letter to Mr. Brocklehurst telling about her evil nature. And actually Jane is not at all a bad girl, but Mrs. Reed considered her as a bad girl and intimated Mr. Brocklehurst about her evil qualities, bad qualities, and therefore Mr. Brocklehurst introduced her as a liar. And Jane comes into friendship with a girl there named Helen Burns, and she became a very good friend to Jane, Helen Burns. And she behaved almost like a martyr, and she was ready to sacrifice anything This girl, Helen Burns, seemed to be ready to sacrifice anything. And she never complained about any misgivings, and she had no complaints against the authorities. She suffered all the difficulties there. Helen Burns was a symbol of fortitude, forbearance, forgiveness, and she made friendship with Helen Burns. But unfortunately, there appeared a massive typhus. A typhoid disease appeared in the hostel, and many of the girls became dead. Helen Burns also became dead in the typhus attack. There was a massive typhus attack on the students in the boarding house, and many of them were dead, including Helen Burns. And the day before her death, Jane Eyre went into her room and slept with her, and in the morning it was identified that Helen Burns was dead. And many girls were dead in the typhus attack. And after all, the benefactors from the town made an inquiry about the things taking place in the Loud School, and Mr. Brocklehurst was driven out of the school. They drove him away from the school. So he was suspended from service. And Jane spends 8 years in the school, 6 years as a student and 2 years as a teacher. 6 years as a student she remained in the school, and then she continued to work there for another 2 years as a teacher. And it was at the time there came an idea in her mind why she could not go and look for a job like the job of a governess. And she found in a newspaper column the requirement of a governess, and she applied for the post. And there was a post of governess at Thornfield Hall, in a manor house called Thornfield Hall. And she accepted the governess position at the manor house called Thornfield. And there she is asked to teach a French girl. Actually, her duty is to teach a French girl named Adela Warrens. So her mother, Celine Warrens, was the lover of the owner of Thornfield House. The Thornfield House was owned by a man named Rochester, Edward Fairfax Rochester was Edward Fairfax Rochester, and he was the owner of the manor house. And he had love affair with a lady named Celine Warrens. And actually she was the mother of a girl named Adela Warrens, and she said that the child was actually Rochester's child, and in reality the child was not the daughter of Rochester. Anyhow, after the death of Celine Warrens, Rochester took the